Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the greatest games on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me, of course, is Jonathan Wilson. And with us this week, we have Carl Worswick, British journalist based in Bogota, dedicated to Colombian football, contributor to World Soccer Magazine, The Guardian, The Blizzard, and many, many more. Carl, a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
A pleasure to be here, Marcus.
Thank you very much. We're going back to the 5th of September 1993 here to the Monumental Stadium in Buenos Aires for a World Cup qualifier that ended Argentina 0, Colombia 5. Carl, why have you chosen this game?
Well, I'm coming up to my 10-year anniversary living in Colombia, a few days shy of that. And in my time here, it's been a constant presence. You just have to say 5-0 and everybody knows what you're talking about. The fact it was against Argentina was significant because Colombia had long lived under their shadow. And for me, it was more everything that went on around the game, not just on the pitch, but all the socio-economic developments and how that game quickly got out of control. And a personal story from when I was 11 or 12 years old. I hated English, weirdly. And in my class, I had an English teacher who was a big football fan. And I think in a way, he wanted to try and engage me by talking about football, because at that age I was, just getting into football properly. And at the end of the class, I remember him telling me about this game. I mean, I think I remember it wrongly because I remember that he had said that he was at the game, but that must have been true because it was September the 5th. He would have been teaching class. So it might have been that he had a friend who was at the game. But from that, the following summer, I put a bet on Colombia, £10, which was a lot for an 11-year-old. To win the World Cup, and I was swanning around school saying, "You'll see, you'll see how good they are." So maybe there's a bit of an unfinished business there. Yeah. And that when I came back to Colombia many, many years later, it was always there at the back of my head.
Of course, after that World Cup, it was you and Pele that had egg on your faces up in Colombia to do so well. I mean, I'm delighted you've chosen this game, Carl, because, again, I have a vague memory. I'm very aware of it, of course, in subsequent years of what an important game it is in Colombian history, but also in Argentinian as well. But it's one of those ones where I didn't know that much about the detail, really. You know, it was a thumping. You've maybe seen one or two of the goals. And my goodness, if you haven't, ladies and gentlemen, do go and check some of those goals out. But we'll get to that in the second half. But some of the stories and the detail and the nonsense, Jonathan, surrounding this game, I mean, it is just wonderful stuff.
Oh, and it's why people like me sort of love writing about South American football, love working in South American football, and also why I couldn't. I tried it in Argentina, I couldn't do it. Just wasn't strong enough for the chaos.
Yeah.
All the sort of side issues, the issues when Colombia land at the airport and they're getting attacked by Argentinian fans, and they even get the stadium the day of the game, and they find the stadium locked so that Argentina fans are all around the bus and hammering on the side of the bus, all that craziness. And we talked about this game in passing when we did the Argentina-Romania game from the '94 World Cup with Rory Smith. And so what we won't talk about much here is where it sits in the Maradona story. That Maradona's been serving his drugs ban. He's still facing drugs charges in the Argentinian courts at this point, and he's at the stadium. And the fans suddenly start chanting his name because they want him back. And it's after this game, he sort of says, well, I might be available. And of course, Argentina were forced into a playoff for the World Cup to qualify for the World Cup because of this. And he does turn out in that playoff, paving the way for what happens in the '94 World Cup when he fails another drugs test. So, I sort of knew about this game from a Maradona-Argentina angle, but it's from a Colombia angle, it's fascinating. And I think there's... perhaps the greatest coach about whom we know the least in Europe is Colombia's coach here. It's Francisco Maturana, who I think is massively important. And it just an astonishing story to do what he did from where he came from with so little experience, a little background, and how he turned Colombia into a team that people genuinely thought had a chance of winning the World Cup.
Yeah. Well, Carl, he was in charge, of course, in the 1990 World Cup when Colombia had turned up and done pretty well. They got through a difficult group. And unfortunately, the René Higuita and Roger Miller incident put them out. But he was a coach that gave them perhaps an identity and dragged them up a bit where they'd previously kind of failed or hadn't really got going.
Yeah, absolutely. He'd only started his managerial career properly in 1986, and by 1987 he was Colombia manager. And they gave him the role provisionally for the Olympic qualifiers for Seoul 88, and he did quite well, so they gave him full time. But yeah, I think he's so important for Colombia's football history, because up until then, I mean, Colombia had gone 28 years without qualifying for a World Cup. And when I spoke to Maturana for the Blizzard, he said, you can't imagine what it's like having to watch a World Cup and having to support Argentina, Brazil, or one of the other South American countries. You're not there. In such a huge football culture. And so, he got them to that World Cup via a playoff against Israel. And the guy who scored, he then doesn't pick. But there's very, very little expectations there, despite Colombia doing really well at the Copa América. And then they go on a tour of for the Stanley Rose Cup. They played Scotland, they played England. Jonathan will like this. One of the English journalists, after they draw 1-1 with England, says that this team reminds me of Hungary of the 1950s. So
it wasn't Jonathan.
So it might have been Jonathan. Good point. I hadn't. And then they beat Finland in Finland, and I think that sort of solidified Maturana's idea. And what he'd done so well, he just plucked ideas from all over the show. He played under Zubeldia, who was Estudiantes coach, who then came over to Colombia in the early 70s. Jonathan will know more about this than me, but I think he was slightly forced out of Argentina because of his way of playing football. It wasn't the prettiest.
Yeah, so his style with Estudiantes, they win the Libertadores 3 times in a row. That's sort of the real anti-football. It's very cynical. It's very physical. It's by whatever means necessary. So, Carlos Bilardo supposedly took pins on the pitch to stab opponents, all that kind of stuff. And eventually, by the early 70s, the government, not the FA, the government, have started to say, you know what? I'm not sure this is great for Argentina's image. And there's the famous game against Milan in the Intercontinental, which was just a bloodbath. I mean, there's what's his name? Combine, the Milan defender, has his jaw broken. There's blood all over it. It's the white Milan shirt. Blood all over his shirt, and as he stretched it off, I shouldn't laugh really, but as he's getting stretched off with a broken jaw, he gets arrested because he was of Argentinian descent and he hadn't done his military service because he hadn't lived in Argentina, which seems pretty reasonable. And this was eventually, I think, it was 3 players were jailed off the back of that game, three Estudiantes players. So yeah, Zubeldia, having been enormously popular sort of mid to late 60s, his star has fallen by the early 70s, so he sort of leaves Argentina under a bit of a cloud. But what's amazing to me is that Maturana, although he takes certain tactical elements, his approach to football in terms of spirit, in terms of the morality of how he played, if you like, is totally different.
Yeah, although it's more, Maturana says it was more the preparation, because Colombia in the 1970s, they hadn't achieved anything. And so it was more how he trained players, the professional idea of what a footballer should be. Because previous to that, they had one training session in the morning and then they'd all go out and do whatever they wanted. He, sort of a Wenger figure, I suppose, started talking to them about their diet and things like that. And then another manager who, Zubeldia's pupil, Bilardo, comes over to Colombia, actually manages Colombia and Deportivo Cali, and he takes ideas from him as well on that idea of professionalising the sport. But it's mainly in the early 80s when he hangs up his boots. He was a decent player, but never really played for Colombia or abroad. And then he takes the idea from a couple of Uruguayan coaches who had been studying what had been happening with Dutch football. And that's where he starts to mould these ideas of total football, I suppose, with the Colombian identity. And he bases his Colombia team on who he was managing, Atlético Nacional, who were the biggest team then. I'm sure we'll go into if you wanted some drug stories that don't involve Maradona, there are quite a few that come from Colombia's side. But yeah, they become so big in Colombia, and the shadow of Pablo Escobar helps that, I'm sure. And he uses them as a base. Now, he would say, look, I'm training with them 4 or 5 times a week, so it makes sense to base my team, like Ajax did with Holland. But that opens up some pretty ugly wounds in a country that's so regionalistic as Colombia later, when all the press get on his back for picking his favourite players from the region that he's from, and the favouritism of Atlético Nacional players. But yeah, he was massively, massively important.
And I think that point you make about him fusing the ideas of total football with what was appropriate to Colombia, I think that's the really fascinating thing, because he moves from a man marking system to a zonal marking system, which is, that's the profound stage every country has to go through at some point. And he takes Colombia through that. But whereas you normally think of zonal marking as requiring enormous physical effort, you think of the tremendous pressing of the Dutch teams or Lobanovsky's teams, he finds a way of doing it where you don't have to do that. And that interview you did with him, and I urge everybody to look that interview, because it's a brilliant interview. He's obviously a brilliant talker, and he says kind of, it's just a fascinating thing to read as a man setting out what he's, the philosophy he's sort of he's drawn up as his career went on, how he imposed that. But the point he makes is the way he used it, it meant you had to run less because it meant you understood your position better, so you weren't having to run, and that's how he got people like Valderrama and Asprilla to buy into it. The other thing is he's a dentist.
I was just about to mention that, yeah. So he was like a sponge. He was soaking up all these ideas from the classroom, and he started off his managerial career being a dentist in the morning, and then running training sessions. So all these players would come for appointments, and so he was looking to learn from all different parts of society. So was it? I mean, I think that's what makes.
Tell me if I'm wrong here, but is it significant at all that he's black? I mean, is that unusual for Colombian managers to be black, or was that also kind of an unusual thing in the 80s?
No, not too. I mean, in the 80s, yeah. These days there are a few, but they're the minority. Mm-hmm. So no, that also is quite important. That he comes from Chocó, which is by far and away the poorest area of Colombia. So he didn't really have anyone to give him a hand up in life, and he just built it from scratch. Now there's another really famous Colombian manager. He's probably the most famous of all, the most successful of all time, Gabriel Ochoa Uribe, and he was also a doctor. So there's something there.
But Bilardo was a gynecologist.
Well, they've got all bases covered, if you will.
They work together.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody's happy. I mean, extraordinary man, Maturana, and of course his assistant, Hernan Dario Gomez, was a key man as well in this, or Bolillo, it was his nickname.
Bolillo's his nickname, which means a policeman's truncheon.
Yeah,
because he was very different to Maturana. Uh-huh. They both came from the same area of Colombia, but they always worked together, mm-hmm. and they were really good friends. They used to even sleep in the same bed sometimes before big Colombia games, because he would always pop round to his hotel.
Is that where he got his nickname from?
For his medicine. No, I think I wish it was, but no, it was. It was something to do. He arrived at training one day, and he had a big. He'd been in a fight the night before,
okay.
And that is his personality. He was very abrasive. He was more of a very defensive coach, but they worked together really well. Bad cop, good cop, I suppose. And they'd always work together. And there were times where Maturana was the head coach and Bolillo was his assistant, and then other times where that was reversed. But they were constantly in touch. And sadly, after all this ended in disaster in the 1994 World Cup. Colombia kept going back to both of them for a good 15 years afterwards. I mean, Bolillo was the last manager in 2011. So it was something that they couldn't get over. They kept going back to either Maturana, who would, of course, in 2001 go on to win the Copa América with them, or Bolillo.
I mean, and you know, a number of people listening to this, like myself, would have. I know you're going to probably roll your eyes at this guy, but you know, you're aware of the history of Colombia now with programs like Narcos on Netflix and so on, and aware of what was going on. A very different country then to what it is now. Thank goodness. You've mentioned a bit of the sort of political turmoil and the social turmoil. How important was this football team going into this qualifying for World Cup '94? Was this football team? You mentioned Colombia being very regionalistic as well. Was it a team that people wanted to try and unify the nation, or would that sort of subsequently happen after this result?
No, to this day, I think it's the only sort of glue that brings the country together. And sadly, when things are going well, it's fantastic and everybody buys into it. And people who don't even really like football put on the shirt and watch the game. Even if it's a friendly, women's football, your local shop will have it on in the back. So no, the problem is when things aren't going so well. That's when these divisions open up. I think if you look way back into Colombia's history, and also its topography, that Colombia isn't the only country in South America that has the Andes, but it is the only country where the Andes split into three. So a lot of these cities have lived in pockets for many, many years, for decades, where they've not had a lot of interaction. And with all the problems that came later, Colombia's been bathed in violence and blood ever since its independence. As soon as things start going badly, then these wounds become quite evident. It's almost impossible, even for me, having spent 10 years here, it's almost impossible to understand the emotional, psychological framework of this game, of going into it after those horrible, horrible years of the 1980s, where nearly every single team in the Colombian League were involved in drugs. There's probably one or two that weren't, but and the big three cases are Atlético Nacional with Pablo Escobar, América de Cali, who in 1979 hadn't won anything and suddenly became the biggest, or one of the biggest teams on the continent, with the Cali cartel, and they become quite important in this story. And then there's Millonarios, who Gacha, who was a Colombian associate of Pablo Escobar, who then went on his own path. So all the three big teams were involved in drugs. But by this time, 1993, Pablo Escobar is on his final legs. He knows it. The game's up. His brothers handed himself in. Quite a few of his key associates and his assassins have handed themselves in. He's in hiding. But this is the end of the chapter of where bombs going off left, right and centre. You didn't even really feel safe going out in the street. Even today, when I go out in the street and I just ask someone in the street, can you give me the time? They'll turn their back and walk away. And the explanation I always get is that not security, you can't trust people. So it's really hard to come to terms with that. So the football, and also Colombia's international reputation. And for many, many people, you just think of bombs and the FARC, the guerrilla group, and drugs and Pablo Escobar. When I was in Russia last year, 2 years ago at the World Cup, so many Russians would come up to me and say, Pablo Escobar, Narcos, is the only way they knew how to sort of build that bridge. But they didn't really know that for Colombians, they're very, very sensitive to this. And so they've been sort of ostracized from the international community. And for once, for the first time in many, many years, their football team was shedding a positive light on the country. So it's quite easy to understand how Colombia would get carried away with this, and that's exactly what happens after this 5-0. They invest so much emotion in this roller coaster and thinking that, well, this is showing Colombia as it should be, this beautiful country full of passion and loves football and can play. For once, they can play, and they're not subservient to Argentina for their identity.
Definitely. All right, let's have a quick break, and then we'll talk about the match itself. See you in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the Greatest Games on the Blizzard. Right, let's talk about the match itself then. So Well, I suppose a little bit of a prelude to the match. I mean, Argentina, of course, one of the dominant forces in South American football, and still are. Going into the match, Colombia were top of the qualifying group, having won 3, drawn 2. Argentina was second, 1 point behind Colombia. The qualifying was slightly different to what it is now. Now, obviously, it's one big group. Back then, it wasn't. Now, it's important to say, I think, that Argentina had won the World Cup final in 1990. 91, they won the Copa America. 93, they won the Copa America. And quite incredibly, just as a little side note, the last time they won the tournament as well. But anyway, they were Copa America champions going into this game.
They'd beaten Colombia in the semi-final, which is also significant.
Which was a rather spicy affair.
Beat them on penalties, so they draw, but then beat them on penalties. But then that sets up, or it sort of, I guess it confirms I was going to say the prejudice that other people in South America have about Argentina. It's not. I guess, is it still a prejudice if it's true? There is definitely kind of an arrogance about Argentinian football that they sort of think, we are the leaders and you follow us. And the fact that people like Zubaldia and Bilardo have gone to Colombia and been successful, that in the Argentinian mind sort of just confirms, well, yes, of course, we are the best, and we help out our brethren, but they don't really bother us. And so when they lose to Colombia in Barranquilla in the qualifiers, to begin with, it's their first defeat in 33 games. But also, I just think
since the World Cup final.
Since the World Cup final, yeah. They sort of sleepwalk into that. I just sort of think they'd gone to Paraguay and gone to Peru and won those 2 games, and they sort of thought, yeah, we're there. And there was a real complacency about Argentinian football. I think they hadn't appreciated just how good Colombia were, and they go into that game and suddenly, get beaten quite convincingly, and they never quite recovered from that in this qualifying campaign. That they beat Peru at home, but they only drew at home against Paraguay, which is what means that they need to win, whereas Colombia only need to draw.
Yeah, and Argentina themselves, going into the game that is the focus today. They hadn't been beaten at home for 6 years. They'd never conceded 5 goals or more, and they never lost at home in a World Cup qualifier. It was. Well,
they conceded 6 in the '58 World Cup to Czechoslovakia, but
sorry, forgive me. Yeah, so in World Cup qualifier, it was a rare thing for a side like Argentina to concede that amount of goals. Their record was very, very good in qualifying, of course. They fancied themselves very much, and it is fair to say that they have an air of arrogance about them, and we know, it takes one to know one. We're England fans, so
there's the great Maradona moment. I think it's the day before the game. He's on TV, and he sort of says, you can't change history. Argentina's here, Colombia's here.
Yeah.
And that of course, then becomes sort of notorious.
Really famous.
Indeed, yeah. But Carl,
absolutely.
Colombia hadn't started particularly well in this qualifying campaign. They'd drawn at home to an unfancied Peru side, Tino Asprilla missing a penalty. And then they took a little while to get going. And obviously they beat Argentina, as Jonathan says. But if we can for a moment focus on the great Faustino Asprilla. Again, I'm sort of juggling a few things. I'm desperately wanting to talk about the game, but I just want to give a bit of a prelude, because in that 5-0 game, he looks like the greatest centre forward of all time. But before the game, it wasn't all plain sailing, was it? The archetypal party boy, there was a lot of stories around there. And after the game against Argentina, when they'd won 2-0, he'd gone out and got drunk, and he was thrown out the squad. Is that right?
That's right. But it was mainly because he'd been dropped for that game against Argentina. Mm-hmm. And in typical Tino style, he went off in a sulk, and the following morning disappeared, did a runner. But there's a prelude to this, and that's at the 1993 Copa America, where he's picked for the squad, and that tournament's held in Ecuador. But he only turns up just after the quarterfinal match, because he decided that he would go to a Caribbean island with one of his female friends, and turns up at the airport without a ticket, and the flight's full. So there's a huge scandal where he said, "I'm getting on this flight," and he turns up for the quarterfinal, for the semi-final. He starts the semi-final, and that's where you can start to see that while the drug aspect and the narcos are important in this, there are other factors. and the unity within the squad isn't as what many believe, because Trent Valencia, who was at Bayern Munich at the time, he does an interview after that Copa America, and he says, look, I'm going to start today. It was a friendly against the United States in preparation for the World Cup qualifiers, but as soon as Tino arrives, I know he's going to go straight in the team. And so there was, Maturana always saw him as, he's a good kid, you've just got to look after him, that he had special treatment. So yeah, he does a runner from the Colombia squad after that game in a sulk, and the Colombian FA president says he's not wearing the Colombia shirt ever again. But 2 days later, he backtracks on that. And yeah, things aren't going too well in qualifying, but they still clearly got a really good team. But I think Colombia go into the game against Argentina playing for the draw. And there are a lot of talk. There's a lot of talk here that is Bolillo, the more defensive-minded coach who sets out the tactics. And I think Tino almost plays on the right wing in a 4-5-1. And it's more that they're going to soak up the pressure in the early. And there's a lot of the Argentinian press are nervous. They compare Pibe Valderrama to Adolfo Pedernera, who was one of the greatest. So this is really they're talking of him as one of the greatest, comparing to one of the greatest Argentine players of all time. They're talking about how worried they are about this, how slow their two central defenders are against Tino's speed, and he rips past some players at times in that game. And I think there's one quote where he says that, they're going to have to wear ice skates to keep up with Tino. And just to mention the arrogance in Colombia's most famous commentator, in his preview to the game, he's just about they're just about to kick off, and he says Argentinians think after God come them. Mm-hmm. It's not the saints or the angels; it's the Argentinians. But today we're going to shut up Maradona's big mouth, because these petulant guys, we're going to show him who really plays football. So I think already Colombians are feeding into this idea that this is time to give Argentina.
But I kind of think that's where Esprit is so important in the squad. So there's the incident after the semi-final of the Copa America when Redondo is having a go at the Colombian fullback and sort of saying, "I earn so much more than you." And then Esprit sort of goes, "Yeah, but I earn a lot more than you." And Redondo goes, "Yeah, but you're not as pretty as me." And then, they get to the airport and they're in the bus, and there's Argentinian fans hammering on the window. And Esprit's response is to get some dollar bills out of his pocket and start fanning himself with them. So that, and on the
he loved it.
The game, he gets out his fancy European mobile phone. He goes over to the hardcore Argentinian support and holds up two fingers to say, "I'm going to score 2 goals today," which of course he does. So
he loved it though, Jonathan. I think he probably wanted that.
Yeah, but I can see both sides of it. I can see how Esprit is massively disruptive, but on the other hand, when you're in that kind of environment, have somebody who does not care must be brilliant. Cool. And just on the subject of Esprit, and I don't want to just plug Blizzard Pieces all the time, but the photo essay we did when we sent a photographer to spend a weekend at his ranch is one of the best things we've ever done. That is extraordinary what he gets up to. Dressing as a dinosaur, riding a horse.
I once went to his. I once went to his ranch, and it was a Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. We arrived, and we walked into his living room, and he says, "Okay, I would like to present you to my my wife number 1, wife number 2, and wife number 3." And we started doing the interview, and wife number 2 isn't wearing a bra, and she's quite flaunting her assets. And Tino's just staring at their entire time. We just have to keep stopping the interview. So, Tino, can you concentrate and look at the camera? And that's the way he is. He's so unpredictable and such a vital part in that team. But as things turn out later, he's also a massive disruption, like you say. And he ends up having physical fights with the Colombian press and within his own team. And there's a clique that starts between Pibe and between Tino. And between the two, they have certain members of the squad who were following them, and this break in squad unity becomes really important in the disaster that was the World Cup the following year.
Yeah, I mean, but it's classic Colombian stuff, as you say. You've got all this turmoil going on, but you do have these incredible moments, and this game was undoubtedly one of them. So yes, you have the Colombian players, as you say, Jonathan, being attacked at the airport, then outside the stadium as well. But we get to the game itself, and the game kicks off, and we have to wait a bit of time, 41 minutes until the first goal. But there is some sort of back and forth before then, John.
I think Argentina probably after sort of 35, 40 minutes are thinking, we're okay here. We're getting chances, and probably we will nick one.
You don't think it's going to be 5-0?
And then 4 minutes before half time.
No.
4 minutes before half time, Valderrama gets the ball, lovely little ball outside for Rincon, runs on. And the kind of goal that people just don't score these days.
No.
Little drop of the shoulder, send the keeper one way, go the other, pop it in the empty net. Thanks very much.
But he roasts the defender.
Oh, completely. So it's who is it? It goes.
It's past? A little shimmy as well.
Yeah.
It is. Is it Borelli? No, it must be Ruggeri. He goes past, and it's I mean, those two centre backs, Borelli and Ruggeri, are so slow. It's kind of Espria and Rincon and Valencia have got the beating of the pace all the time.
Yeah, Carl, talking to people, Colombian football fans, not the manager or the players, but the fans themselves who watched the game and witnessed it and so on. What was the feeling with them before the game? Were they confident going into this one?
Yeah, but I think that they would have settled for the draw, knowing how Argentina were seen in Colombia. I mean, at this period, most thinking Colombian football fans, wouldn't. Obviously, the blizzard didn't exist, so they had to turn to El Gráfico. So that all the football cultural identity was forged from, or was stolen from, Argentina. So I think that despite beating them in Barranquilla a few days before, because all these qualifiers are played in a short period of time, it's not like now where it's dragged out over a couple of years. So they knew that they had a good team, but still, this was Argentina.
Yeah.
And up until 1987, they hadn't ever beaten Argentina. So nobody in their wildest dreams would have imagined this result. And that's why still, to this day, every 5th of September, they replay this game on Colombian TV. And the players have to do the same interviews over and over again. And Jonathan mentioned a few of the stories, and I think I start to suspect that a lot of these stories have spun out of control now, and there are so many myths that go along with it that we'll get to in a bit. But in that first half, I think Colombia touched the ball once in the first in the box once in the first 20 minutes. And clearly, they're always looking to give PB the Valderrama the ball, but he's suffocated. And the first time he does break through, he plays that beautiful ball through, and Colombia score. But it's probably the second goal that's the most important, because that really means that Argentina throw everything at Colombia, and they leave, as John said, those two central defenders get ripped apart. And they didn't really have any choice, because the situation was that if Paraguay had beaten Peru, then Argentina wouldn't have even qualified for the playoff against Australia. They would have been dumped out. And Peru were winning 2-0. Paraguay pulled it back to 2-2. They just needed one more goal to dump Argentina out. You don't know how much information the players have got, especially back then, but certainly it was a possibility when you're getting thumped 5-0.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, and also you mentioned about, Valderrama being stifled. I mean, this is Argentina side, if people are wondering, we got Diego Simeone and Fernando Redondo in there, for crying out loud. Battistuta.
Yeah, that's the centre midfield, Simeone and Redondo, you take that.
It's not too shabby. So 1-0 at half-time, you mentioned 2-1. I mean, how Argentina, when the ball gets sort of knocked into the box for the second goal and Espria takes it down, and then with those kind of long legs of his, easy going one way there, that sort of shimmy, he's so good at that. Again, not past the defender and slots home. You think, how on earth did they leave the defender one-on-one with Espria? But 2-0.
It's a really good pass, to be fair.
It is,
to Rincon. I mean, he's round about halfway line, and he hits to call it a long diagonal. makes you think of Big Sam, and it's a bit unfair. It's a really good sort of 40, 45-yard pass. But then, yeah, it's a skill to beat Borelli. Because when you see it initially from the sort of normal main camera, you sort of think, oh, he's just cut inside him, and Borelli sort of let him go a bit easily. But then you actually see it from behind the goal, and you see the swerve of the hips, and you understand. I mean, Borelli can't touch him for pace, but he gets done for skill there as well.
And Argentina just start coming forward, and we should mention Oscar Cordoba in goal for Colombia, who had a good game. It can be sometimes forgotten that they did keep a clean sheet, and he was decent. I mean, Carl, I might be missing something obvious here, but he was in goal. Where was René Higuita at this time? We're talking Colombian football in the 90s. I've got to ask about René Higuita. Was he in the side on the squad?
He was in jail.
Yeah, okay. I knew there would be something.
Yeah.
Even something wouldn't be quite straightforward here. I was thinking, where was old René in this? So he was in the slammer.
So a couple of months beforehand, he'd offered himself to one of the big narco bosses to mediate in the handover in a kidnapping case. It was the daughter of a narco. Now, that in itself was slightly weird, but the fact that he was paid by the narco for his services landed him in jail. And afterwards, in the changing room, when they're celebrating 5-0, they start chanting his name. And the following day, when they get back to Bogota, they personally ask the president. Pibe goes up to the president and says, please release him. And before the World Cup, he has been released by this time, but the president rings Maturana and says, no, don't pick René Higuita. It would be really bad for our country's reputation. So, he was definitely part of that group, but for obvious René reasons, he wasn't.
I mean, Cordoba was a really
president.
Good keeper. I mean,
he was young at that point. He was quite young, 22, 23. And here in Colombia, it's weird because a lot of people say, no, he was man of the match. He was brilliant in the first half. He didn't actually do very much at all in the first half. But there's a period of about 15, 20 minutes at the start of the second half where he pulls off some really, really good saves. And you can see that he isn't... And we were talking beforehand of how Colombia had looked at that Dutch team. And what's he called? Jongblad? I don't know how you pronounce that. But the goalkeeper, the Dutch... and how he could play with his feet, one of the first goalkeepers who did it quite well. And Higuita obviously did really, really well, and there were some famous cases where he messed up, like against Cameroon. But also Cordoba is nowhere near as good as him, but he does come off his line quite a few times. There's one point where there's about 8 people in the box, and the cross comes in, but the cross is to the edge of the box, and he comes flying out to collect it, and he's in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, he was fundamental in that really difficult moment. That if Argentina get a goal back at 2-0, then they could. You could see the momentum taking in, changing the course of the game. But he made some really good saves, and Colombia just play a really intelligent game, just waiting.
Because he goes on and is part of Bianchi's great Boca side at the end of a decade that ends up beating Real Madrid in the Intercontinental final in 2000.
Yeah, he's seen as a hero there. Yeah, and then he moves to he's still seen as possibly the greatest Colombian goalkeeper of all time, alongside Higuita.
Yeah, I mean, definitely worthy to mention him in this game. Absolutely. So you have Colombia scored, shortly before half time, shortly after half time, but then from 49 minutes to 72 minutes, there's a little bit of a gap where, as we say, Cordoba's sort of the main man, really, and then on 72 minutes, Rincon really kind of finishes the game off. The celebrations would suggest as well. I mean, it's a funny one because when it goes to 3-0, obviously I've only got hindsight here watching highlights and so on, but it reminded me almost, if you'll indulge me for a brief moment, everybody, when England go 3-1 up away to Germany.
It's exactly that. I thought that as well. It's exactly the same thing.
Okay.
It's a home team thinking, what on earth's going on here? We better attack because it's embarrassing. But their defenders are so slow that every time they do that, they just get caught on the break again.
But from a fan point of view, I remember watching that game. Obviously, England hadn't beaten Germany for years. And I thought to myself, I don't want England just to win by 1 or 2 goals. I want them to hammer them. That third goal for England, to me, was like, right, get those floodgates open. Come on. And it felt like that watching the highlights. That when Rincon scores that third goal, it felt like that for me a bit.
But it's only 2 minutes later when Asprilla gets the best goal of the night, where he dispossesses Borelli and runs to the box. It's the most beautiful thing.
That's absolutely phenomenal.
It's almost in slow motion, isn't it? It's beautiful. Yeah. And his assist for the last goal as well is amazing. But there is another, I don't know if it's true or not, but certainly a story that all the players tell, that it's before the 5th goal that Simeone bashes El Tren Valencia's lip, bursts his lip open, and calls him, and immediately Barrabás Gomez, who's the younger brother of Bolillo Gomez, runs over to the referee and says to the referee, don't send him off, because if you send him off, they're just going to say that we lost 5-0 because we were down to 10 men. And apparently the Uruguayan referee turns around to Barrabás and says, all right, I won't send him off, but score another goal against these sons of a bitch. Who knows what the truth is, but
can that be true?
There's another...
It's South America, I suppose.
It doesn't sound likely, but all the players tell this story. So, and there's another story from the first half that we missed of a plane almost crashing into the stadium. And there is a photo in, I think it's El Gráfico, of this plane coming within meters of the stadium because the pilot knows that this game's going on and decides to give his passengers a quick look. Hey, look over the left-hand side, you'll see that Colombia playing Argentina, but goes very, very, very close to causing one of the greatest.
And the pilot got sacked.
Disasters
I mean, it's definitely happened because A, there's a photo, and B, the pilot got sacked a couple of days later.
I mean,
that story definitely is true, yeah.
It's why we love South American football and South America in general, because it's very different to Europe.
Was worth the risk.
Well, why not? They got away with it, didn't they? But yeah, so I mean, Asprey, as you say, scores that fantastic 4th goal, and then the 5th goes in. I mean, it's just before the 5th goes in. Actually, there's a moment where they bring out a few tricks. The Colombians. I think the ball is kind of knocked to Valderrama in the centre of the pitch, and he does this lovely little back here, and they're taking the piss. They are at this point.
It's the humiliation then, yeah. And I think that's the first time that Colombia show the type of football that they played in 1990 against that game against West Germany, where they spend the entire game just passing it around without seemingly wanting to score until they really need to. And that last period is when they really start to enjoy themselves. Because I was looking at statistics of this before, and there are 57 fouls in this entire game, which is, in the first half, there were over 30. So they weren't able to play that football until Argentina really had given up the goal. So, I think it couldn't have been more perfect that they got all these these things crammed into one game.
And then El
Gráfico,
which, as you say, has a huge reach over the continent. You know, although it was Buenos Aires based, I mean, it's sadly defunct now, but it is the magazine for South America, and its front page is just black with the word Vergüenza, shame. And I mean, I mean, but imagine being an England fan, as you are, Marcus, and seeing,
are we all in this call?
Kicker or something like that.
Yeah.
With whatever the German word for shame is, Schade on the front.
I'd be very happy to see it personally. But
so were Colombians.
Yeah, I bet they were. Basile, the Argentina coach, said, "I never want to think about that match again. It was a crime against nature." I don't know what he means there. A day I wanted to dig a hole in the ground and bury myself in it. I mean, my goodness. We know that they can be, that emotions can be heightened in football, especially in that part of the world. But, Carl, I mean, the fallout from this game.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that after the 4th goal goes in, the Bolillo turns to Maturana, and you think that they'd just be going wild, but he turns to him and says, "Ahora sí nos jodimos," and that means, right, now we're fucked. Everybody's gonna demand that we win the World Cup, and it's a moment that a rare moment of Colombia him alone really realising what Colombia have got themselves into, and it's quite prophetic. There's a really famous book by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called Chronicle of a Death Foretold, and I think that one line at that point in the game is very similar of this disaster that everybody knows really deep down is going to happen, but nobody can stop it.
But it's a funny one.
And after the game...
Yeah, sorry, Carl.
After the game, it does really almost immediately spirals out of control.
Yeah, it's such a funny one, isn't it? Because again, as a, if you were a Colombia fan, in hindsight, you might be able to see that. You might be able to think, do you know what, actually, if we'd have won 2-0 or by the odd goal or even a draw, because they were top of the group, you think to yourself, okay, it would have been calmed down. But then in another kind of way of thinking of it, had they have won 2-0, I don't think they would have won the World Cup in '94. They might have gone down there slightly better or something.
But it might have been quite the disaster that it was. And disaster,
possibly
overused in football. It's not overused here. It was a disaster. In the very...
I know what you mean, Jonathan, but that game's played every year. What a memory to have. And football is about these memories.
No, I mean, in terms of having the memory, I'm sure they would rather have it, but the consequences were tragic.
Mm-hmm.
100 people died that night in Colombia. 1,000 were injured in the celebrations in Colombia alone. Because it was Argentina, and it's almost impossible to understand how for 10, 15 years, as Colombia started to build this reputation for being a decent football nation, whenever they played in Colombia, the Argentinians would spit at them, they would call them drug dealers, and suddenly here's you getting one over of them. It is sort of understandable how they got carried away with this, but there was nobody there to put the brakes on and say, steady on, lads. And it's not just that psychologically that players got carried away, and they clearly did. It was everything. It was how everybody wanted, especially not just the drug dealers, the big cartels, but also business interests. I mean, Colombia, after this game, between January 1994 and the World Cup in June 1994, played 22 friendlies, which is just an extraordinary amount of games. And the players didn't want to play them, but because the federation had signed a deal with the big brewery Bavaria here, everybody wanted to have a piece of the action. They all wanted to make the coin. And even when Colombia were the last country to arrive at the World Cup, and they arrived with fans you could buy a special ticket to travel with the team to the World Cup. The preparation was an absolute disaster. If there was a manual for how to prepare for a World Cup, Colombia broke every single rule.
And then they lose to Romania in the first game, and then the famous game against the US when Andres Escobar scores the own goal and is subsequently murdered.
Yeah, a great shame. But in terms of the context of this match, Carl, an absolutely fascinating story. Never a dull moment when we're talking about Colombian football. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast and talking to us about this. It's been an absolute pleasure. For more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. But Carl, thank you very much indeed for coming on.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure too.
Jonathan, a pleasure as always.
Cheers, thank you.
We're back, of course, next week with another game from the history of football. We shall see you then. Ta-ta.